She had never believed in miracles until the day 3 tiny cries changed everything. Sophie Miller, 28, pale as porcelain and small for her age, lay in the hospital bed with exhaustion etched into the hollows beneath her eyes. The delivery had been long and terrifying. 3 babies, each dark-skinned and perfect, like little moons wrapped in white. The nurses moved with quiet awe. The doctors murmured about rare cases and genetic surprises. Sophie stared at the 3 faces and felt something close to wonder, and something like fear, all at once. Her mother, Elaine, had arrived an hour later, hair pinned back, eyes sharp and practical. She kissed Sophie's forehead, then smiled at the babies in a way that suggested she already claimed them as her new grandchildren. It should have been a day of joy, a private miracle to be celebrated within the family. But 10 days after the birth, while sorting through a stack of old letters in the attic, Elaine found a photograph wedged in a yellowing envelope. A photograph she had never seen before. The moment the image met her gaze, the air around her seemed to change. The photograph had been taken 21 years earlier. A young woman stood on the porch of a run-down apartment building, clutching a baby wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was short, her eyes the same icy gray that had softened into Elaine's current expression. Behind her, leaning in the doorway, stood a man with a high cheekbone and a wide, easy smile. A man Elaine knew well. It was her husband, gone from their lives for nearly 2 decades. She remembered his laugh, the way he used to whistle as he fixed things around the house. She remembered the suitcase, the slammed door, the way his absence had become a background rhythm. Elaine felt her breath catch. She ran her fingers over the back of the photo where handwriting had faded. June 2004. For you, it read. If you ever need me, call. The number had been crossed out. The note was unsigned. Memories. Rushed back. Whispered arguments. A suitcase by the door. A slammed car trunk. Had there been a secret? Had her husband been leading another life? The photograph pulsed between the pages like a small, demanding truth. Sophie had always believed her family could survive almost anything. Her father, James, had left when she was 4 and had been a ghost in family stories, sometimes cruel, sometimes tender, always unpredictable. Elaine had never spoken much about him. Sophie had filled the gaps with imagined conversations, with comforting myths of forgiveness. The babies should have been a new beginning, proof that life could surprise you with joy. But the photograph cast a shadow over everything that felt safe. Elaine kept the photo to herself at first. She watched Sophie from across the hospital room, watched the way the new mother traced the downy hair of each baby, the way she hummed under her breath as if keeping them safe through song. Night after night, Elaine sat in the rocking chair, phone in her hand, deciding whether to call a number that had been crossed out long before she was ready to face its consequences. On the 11th day, unable to bear the secret any longer, Elaine dialed. The line clicked, and a voice answered. A man's voice deeper with years and unfamiliar accents. He paused when she spoke his name, and there in the pause was 20 years of absence. His name was Malcolm Carter. The voice trembled. Elaine spoke slowly, as if the sound of his name might dissolve if she rushed. Malcolm said her name as if confirming she was real. What followed was a conversation like a map of old wounds. Malcolm had been young and restless, chasing art and music, leaving a small town suffocating in its expectations. He had fallen for an impulsive idea of himself and drifted toward city streets where he slept on couches and in doorways. There had been a woman then, a young mother named Rosa, who had trusted him with a life he wasn't yet ready to hold. They had their baby and shared a close, fierce love that was swallowed by his fear. He left, promising to come back when he could get himself right, and then he didn't. 11 days after the birth, he came to the hospital. He stepped into the room as if the air had changed. He looked different now. A beard threaded with salt, a few silver at the temple, tattoos at his wrists peeking from beneath his sleeves. But his eyes, the way they watched the babies, were the same. He said he had heard through a friend. He said he had been trying to find them for years. Elaine listened, the photo burning in her pocket like a secret heartbeat. Sophie looked up when the man spoke, and something fell into place that Sophie had not known she was waiting for. "These are my grandchildren," Malcolm said, voice small and reverent. He reached out and, with a tremor, touched the cheek of one baby. Sophie's hand snapped forward to steady him. She didn't understand the story in full. She only knew that the man's hands were familiar, as if she had seen that shape in the grain of her own palm. There was something about the set of his jaw that felt like an echo of someone she had loved and lost. Over the next few days, questions multiplied like shadows. Hospital rooms closed around whispered conversations, old friends passed notes, and strangers offered sympathetic looks. DNA tests were arranged with careful sensitivity. The hospital staff wrapped delicate legal procedures in soft language like bandages. When the results came back, they were luminous in their clarity. Malcolm was the father of each of the triplets, 3 tiny heartbeats connected to a man who had been missing from their lives for years. The revelation shattered the smooth surface of Elaine's life. She paced the hospital corridor, phone pressed to her ear, demanding answers she didn't know how to ask. Malcolm told a story of mistakes and atonement, of guilt and a lifetime of trying to buy back time with small acts that never felt like enough. He spoke of the mothers of his children, of the woman he'd loved, and the daughters and sons who had scattered across cities he barely knew. He spoke of being a different man now, tired and braver, trying to repair what he had broken. Sophie, who had been raised on stories of resilience, took the news in a way that surprised both her and her mother. She paced the nursery, rocking each baby in turn, whispering stories she had made up for them in the dim hours. It wasn't until she overheard Malcolm say, in a conversation with a nurse, that the truth hit her full force. I didn't even know any of them existed until 3 months ago. How could he not know? How could a father not know he had 3 sons? The questions cut like new paper. Yet beneath the cut, Sophie felt another current, a tenderness for the man who stood at the edge of their lives, who had come back to hold a piece of the past he had once thrown away. She thought of the baby's dark eyes and tiny hands, of the way they fit in her arms like fragments of light. It occurred to her that parenthood wasn't always made of planning and certainty. Sometimes it arrived like a storm, whether you had ordered it or not. News traveled in the small town like a weather front, sudden and unstoppable. Some neighbors whispered suspicion, others offered help. There were cruel comments online, people who assumed scandals where there were only complicated histories. The hospital became a small theater for the town's curiosity. When Elaine and Malcolm argued in the corridor, a long, quiet argument about betrayal and blame and why some people leave. Yet in the nursery, the 3 babies slept and grew plumper, their breaths steady and infinitesimal. Malcolm did not demand forgiveness. He asked for space, and then for chance. He visited every day, folding his frame into the corner chair, holding a single infant like a relic. Sometimes he read aloud, poetry he loved as a young man, verses he had promised himself he'd give to a child someday, and Sophie watched the cadence of words soften the lines on his face. The triplets began to know him by the shape of his voice, the smell of his cologne, the way he hummed when he fed them diluted sugar water at odd hours. Elaine found herself at the center of an old storm she had thought long dispersed. The photograph she had found was not simply evidence of an old love. It was proof that their family had been more complicated than the tidy stories she'd told Sophie. She remembered nights when James had been a ghost and asked herself what she knew then. She thought of forgiveness, of boundaries, of how to protect Sophie and the babies while also honoring the child she had once loved and lost to circumstance. One night, when the 3 infants were sleeping and the ward hummed with a lullaby of machines, Malcolm sat across from Elaine. He pulled an old envelope from his coat and placed it gently on her hand. Inside were letters he'd written and never sent, photographs that matched the one she had found, and a small, careful note addressed to Elaine, "If you ever find this." His handwriting had the same slant she remembered from youth, the same impatient loops. "I thought I deserved the silence," he said. "I thought if I came back I'd only cause pain. But when I heard about Sophie, I couldn't stay away." Elaine's hands trembled as she read the notes. They spoke of regret and explanation and a love that had been both fierce and foolish. They told of a life that had warped around survival and the work of rebuilding. They did not ask for absolution. They laid down the truth and left her to decide what to do with it. Sophie expected anger and judgment to swallow the room, but instead found a complicated peace settling like dusk. She spent days watching Malcolm with the babies, watching him learn their tiny ways. He could not fix the years he'd missed, but he could sit and learn and touch and hold. When she asked him why he had left, his answer was quiet and honest. Fear. A selfishness he'd tried to mend all his life. It wasn't a satisfying reason, but it was true. Time does strange work with grief and joy. As the weeks passed, Malcolm became part of the new rhythm. He came to pediatrician appointments, held feeds when Sophie needed to sleep, and sat in the nursery with a book open while the babies nursed. He sent for records, for pictures of himself as a young man, for the proof that this life had a thread connecting it to theirs. He was not always welcome. There were visits that ended in sharp words and slammed doors, but there were also quiet evenings where the three babies would cluster against his chest and breathe in the safety his presence offered. People outside the hospital had opinions. Some accused Elaine of hiding a secret. Others condemned Malcolm for old crimes of absence. Sophie found herself mediating between history and practical needs, between the angry internet and the tender reality of three infants who needed food and lullabies. She leaned on friends who offered help without judgment, and on the nurses who had become gentle anchors. Through it all, the babies grew, and with each small growth they claimed a place in the world, indifferent to scandal and deserving of tenderness. On the 45th day after the birth, the family returned home. The house was smaller than Sophie remembered. It smelled like coffee and old paper. Elaine had scrubbed and prepared, turning a room into a nursery with care that looked like penance and devotion. Malcolm arrived with a cardboard box of baby clothes and a shy smile. For them, he said simply. The triplets, Jonah, Isaiah, and Micah, began to fill the house with noise, tiny hiccups, the rustle of blankets, the smell of milk. Sophie learned the rhythm of their bodies, the way Jonah blinked at sunlight, how Isaiah kicked when upset, how Micah made a small grunt that meant he was curious. Each of them held a piece of wonder and a challenge that made Sophie both tired and fierce with love. Parents are not only those who raise a child, they are the ones who show up. Malcolm showed up. He proved himself in small things, a midnight feed, the careful timing of bathwater, the way he remembered each child's favorite blanket. He also proved fallibility. He occasionally disappeared for hours and returned with shame in his eyes. Each absence curved the family's conversation like a saw through wood, each return repaired with patience and honest effort. Slowly, trust was like a fabric woven thread by thread. Community pressure eased as the townspeople saw the daily care. Some neighbors, who had once whispered, began to offer casseroles and cover grocery runs. Friends who had been skeptical watched Malcolm help with diapers and groceries and softened. Forgiveness is not a single act but many small decisions, the repetition of kind things even when it's easy to be bitter. Sophie saw it happen at breakfast, when a neighbor handed over a tray, and at the park, where Malcolm pushed a stroller with a careful focus. Of course, there were days of anger. Elaine sometimes called him by the name only used in the rooms where she kept her grief, a name that carried the weight of abandonment. They argued about money, about boundaries, about names, about the future. Sophie screamed at him once in the kitchen until her throat hurt, words spilling from places she had kept locked. Malcolm listened, regret reflected in his face, and when the storm passed he would apologize without theatrics. He didn't offer grand promises, he offered small consistent actions instead. As months coalesced into a year, the children learned to walk and to laugh. The town stopped speaking in sharp edges and began to notice the easiest things. The way the three brothers chased each other in the yard, the way they shared snacks, the way they slept piled together in a single bed. Malcolm's hands became known, not as symbols of a scandal, but as the hands that made. Wobbly wooden train, the hands that held on when the youngest fell. He found work at a community center teaching music to kids, and the sound of a small drum or a shaky guitar became another thread tying him to the present. Sophie learned there are different nouns for the same truth. Abandonment and absence had been synonyms for years, but now she had to learn that presence could be redefined. Love, she discovered, could be messy and patient at once. Her mother, Elaine, who had once been a fortress of polished certainty, softened as well. The photograph that had once felt like a dagger became instead a faded map, a record of what had been, and a guide to what might still be made whole. And slowly something unexpected unfolded. The shocking secret turned out to be less like an ending, and more like an unlatched door. The truth rearranged their lives, but it did not destroy them. It offered an uneasy grace. On the first birthday, As the three boys babbled around a cake, Sophie looked at her mother and Malcolm and saw not only the past but a future that felt raw and real. They were flawed people, but they were theirs.